So dear friends, today is the 12th of August, the year 2018, and we are sitting in the Still Waters Meditation Hall, Dharma Cloud Temple, Plum Village, France. And it's so nice to be here with so many young people. I think it's actually unbelievable. Like my sisters and brothers have been sharing, it seems like you have so many options to go to, and then you chose to go to a monastery. And all you do is sit and walk and eat and lie down. I don't know. There's not too many attractions around, not too many exciting things happening for you, and yet somehow you chose to be here. And I find that's quite commendable and quite brave. Today, the topic that I was asked to share about is understanding our mind. And I'm not sure if I could share it with you in the time slot that I have. 42 minutes left. No, 47 minutes left. But I'll try. But I wanted to share about understanding our mind in the context of love. And I know that tomorrow you'll have a talk about true love. So this is kind of like what Joe was saying. This is like his opening act. He was my opening act, so I'm the opening act for my brother tomorrow. So while I was on tour in Japan earlier this year, this spring, a very respectable young monk introduced me to a band called BTS. I don't know if any of you know them. Can you raise your hands if you know who they are? Oh, okay. At least some. Can I ask, are you Army? No? Okay. BTS is a Korean K-pop group, and they have, earlier this year, their album hit #1 on the US Billboard's 200. And there was an article in The Guardian titled, Korea's Other Summit. Because as you know, the North and South Korea had a meeting earlier. The presidents of the North and South of Korea met earlier this year, and they had some reconciliation, which is great news for the world. And I saw on the papers that they had, soldiers kind of like disassembling the speakers that were put between the borders of North and South Korea, projecting propaganda to the other side. And speakers that were powerful enough that could go, I think, 20 miles or something. So it's quite a powerful image to see soldiers disassembling those speakers. And also there have been talks about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So I felt this year there was a lot of good news from Korea, North and South Korea. And so this band, I just want to share, K-pop. You might be surprised that a nun is, or a monk is even listening to music. That's on the billboards. So I just want to say that their new album is called Love Yourself. Love Yourself. And so there was a lot of interviews with this band, and a lot of people asked them what this album is about. And they wanted to share about the darker side of love. They have a series of albums. And the latest one, Love Yourself Tear, they wanted to share about the darker side of love. And in interviews, the leader of the band he said that if you cannot be true to yourself, then you cannot love. And he expressed that his goal in this life, and he's also very young, about 25 or 26. He said that his goal in life is to really love himself, down to the bones, I guess. Truly, truly love himself, and even if it takes a lifetime, that's his ultimate goal. So I found it was quite noble for a young person to express a desire like that. And in interviews, people asked him, so how do you love yourself? What does it mean to love yourself? And I didn't hear such clear answers from him. But maybe they're waiting for the next album, which is which is Love Yourself Answer. And it's coming out in August, something, I don't know, end of August. So I'd be interested to know what this answer to Love Yourself is from a K-pop band who is having sold-out concerts throughout the world. And for me, what that means is that the young people are listening. And they want to know what this message is about love yourself. And maybe some of you are here also. You want to know how to love yourself. But the question is, you want to love yourself, but the question is how. And in Plum Village, love is something very concrete for us. And we say that you cannot love if you cannot understand. If you cannot understand, you cannot love. So love for us is based on understanding. And when we speak about loving ourselves, we have to ask, what are we loving? Do we understand enough about ourselves to love ourselves? So I guess today I'll begin with understanding our mind in that context. I'd like to write some things on the board. You'll have to excuse me if I keep looking at the watch because this is a big topic. So in Buddhism, we say that the human being is made of 5 skandhas, or 5 aggregates. And so you have body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And these 5 aggregates are, we often compare them to 5 rivers. And these are the 5 rivers that we are made of. And they're always flowing and changing. And when we look into ourselves, when we say we want to love ourselves, it should be very concrete, right? So we look into our body. How much do we understand of our body? Yesterday, Brother Faplu, he shared about And the first four breathing exercises, simply coming back to the in-breath and the out-breath, being aware of the whole body and relaxing the whole body. That's a very concrete way of expressing love to your body, showing care for your body. And that's only the beginning. Because when we can come back to our breathing, when we can come home to our bodies, we can recognize what's going on in our body. Maybe there's tension, maybe there's aggravation, restlessness in our body. And we can come back to the breathing in order to calm down the body, calm down the agitation, the tension, releasing the tension. So body. These five skandhas, actually, you can see them as just two, body and mind. Feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness belong to mind. Actually, body also belongs to mind, but that's a bit more complicated. You can learn about that later. Feelings and perceptions are also types of mental formations, but because they are so big, they have their own categories. And I won't speak about feelings and perceptions so much today because we will have other Dharma talks about how to take care of our feelings and perceptions, especially in the beginning, a new presentation. And mental formations are also a part of consciousness. So when we look into ourself, we should be able to identify these five aggregates. And I'd like to share a little bit about consciousness and our understanding of consciousness or mind. In Buddhism, I don't think we claim to be experts in how the mind works, but we do have a very simple model that has been very useful and very effective in our practice of transformation, our practice of bringing about peace and well-being into our body and our mind, and also a practice about transforming our suffering. So this is a very, very simple model, but very effective model of mind I'd like to share with you today. So when we speak about consciousness, we have what we call stored consciousness, and mind consciousness. We also have the first five consciousnesses, which are our sensory impressions, the eyes. I am not an artist, so I hope you can recognize the ear, the nose, uh, the tongue, and body, or somatosensory. So you have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and your somatosensory consciousness. And so in stored consciousness, it's said that we have all the seeds. You can see it as all, you can understand it as a kind of potentials. Or neuroscientists nowadays, they say neural pathways. So we have all kinds of seeds are stored in our consciousness, our stored consciousness. We have seeds of happiness, seeds of joy, seeds of sadness, seeds of anger, seeds of despair, seeds of fear. Every single type of potential can be found in your stored consciousness. And mm, and everyone has all kinds of seeds, all these seeds. And there are, in some Buddhist schools, we say there are 51 mental formations. So these seeds are mental formations, the seeds of mental formations. So how does this model of mind work? You receive sensory input from your eyes, your ears, nose, tongue, touch. Whatever is in your environment, it will touch off a seed in you. Let's say you're sitting in this hall. Everybody is very calm, peaceful. So just sitting in this hall, your eyes, ears, nose, somatosensory input is receiving information that touches off the seed of peace in you and the seed of calm, for instance. So we say that these seeds, the seed of calm, is watered. And the more you touch off the seed of calm, the seed of peace in you, the bigger those seeds grow in the level of your stored consciousness. Let's say if you were in touch with anger, something in the environment in your thinking has triggered off anger. So it touches the seed of anger, and this anger manifests in your mind consciousness, and uh, you can recognize it as anger. Yeah. So when these seeds are touched up in your stored consciousness, they will manifest in your mind consciousness as anger, as peace, or happiness, or joy, etc. The longer they stay on the level of your perception, on the level of your awareness, mind consciousness, at the base, the seeds grow stronger. Um, so let's say if anger stays in your mind consciousness for 15 minutes, that's 15 minutes that at the base, the seed of anger can get stronger. And if fear stays in your mind consciousness for half an hour, that's how long it gets in order to become stronger at the base. And so what happens when a seed in stored consciousness becomes very strong, very big? For instance, if your seed of anger is touched off every single day, many times a day, and it becomes so big in your stored consciousness, what happens? The next time someone says something very tiny, right? Anger manifests very quickly. It's because you've kind of strengthened that neural pathway. And so it gets activated very easily and very quickly. Someone can say the same thing to one person, they don't really react at all to that very same thing. But another person reacts very strongly to the same thing that's being said. It's because that other person, the seed of anger in him or her, is very strong. This is a very basic principle that we all have to know when we practice mindfulness or meditation. In terms of neuroplasticity, they say, use it or lose it, right? The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. The less you use it, the weaker it becomes. You can lose the strength of it. So let's say if anger is not watered in you too often, you start out with a very strong seed of anger. and you don't really touch it off, you don't really water it very often, then it becomes weaker in you. I know this from personal experience. Uh, Before I became a nun, I became angry very easily. My brothers and sisters could say the smallest things, and like I just explode. I start cursing, etc. But now they can say a lot more things, and I don't curse at them. I may think things, but I don't curse. It's because, through the years, when anger comes up, I've learned how to say, hello, anger. And so the practice, what do we do with all this information, and how do we practice with this? When a seed has been watered in you and it comes up in your mind consciousness, our practice is simply to recognize it, say hello to it. If anger comes up, you just simply say, hello, anger, I know you're there. And that already, you are already intervening with the neural pathway that normally goes on, that normally gets activated. For instance, someone says something, you become angry, you react, right? That's kind of a neural pathway. You come in contact with something, you hear something, you see something, you feel anger, anger comes up, and you think something, you perceive it as something, and then you react out of anger. But now with the practice, anger comes up in you, and you take a breath, and you just say, hello, anger. Breathing in, I know I'm angry. Breathing out, I know my anger is there. And that already intervenes with that normal neural pathway. Mm. And you have a chance to either react or to not react. And the more you do this without reacting in the normal patterns that you do, you kind of rewire your brain. You kind of rewire um, your consciousness. So when we speak about consciousness, we know that consciousness is always consciousness of something. You can never have consciousness alone. Like when you say you are mindful, it's always mindfulness of something. I'm drinking tea and I'm mindful of drinking my tea. I'm drinking my tea. I know that I'm drinking my tea. So that's being mindful of drinking your tea. When you walk and you know that you're walking, that's mindfulness of walking. So mindfulness is always mindfulness of something. You cannot just say, oh, I'm mindful. Mindful of what? What are you mindful of? And the same, you cannot just say, I'm angry, right? I think when I was younger, I didn't really know how to look a little bit deeper. So sometimes when anger comes up, I just feel, this anger. I'm angry. But anger is always angry of what? What are you angry about? So if you take the time to look a little bit more deeply, you can recognize why you are angry. You're always angry about something. And it cannot just be that you're angry. I just feel anger. It doesn't make sense in terms of subject and object of consciousness. So the subject and object are always one. Many scientists nowadays, and even many among us too, we may believe that mind is in the brain. Mind is in the brain. And it reaches out to understand our environment and the things outside of us. And so there's this mind that's happening inside in our environment, which is completely separate from mind. And this is simply untrue. Let's say you are sitting here and you feel this peace, right, in the environment. What you are feeling is not separate from the environment. If the environment doesn't have this peace, you may probably not feel the peace. And another example, let's say you walk into a room and the environment is quite hostile, and you can pick it up right away. So the hostility is not exactly outside of you, it's also in you. And the hostility in you is also the hostility outside of you. So this is quite an important concept to understand, that the subject and object of mind are never separate. So let's say when you look into your anger, you always have to identify anger of what? Mindfulness, you always have to identify mindful of what? Subject and object are not two. If I'm afraid, what am I afraid of? If I'm happy, what am I happy of? So you start to look more deeply into your feelings and perceptions and mental formations. These also all have the subject and object are not separate. So when you look into your feelings, sad, what am I sad about? You begin to understand them a bit more clearly. You look deeply into them and you can identify exactly why you are sad, or exactly why you are angry, exactly why you are afraid. Mm. Also, consciousness is also made of individual and collective consciousness. You cannot find consciousness that is individual alone, and you cannot find consciousness that is purely collective, just outside of you alone. All of your individual consciousnesses make up the collective, and the collective consciousness makes up your individual consciousness. For instance, your sense of style, right? Your sense of style is not just your own, but it's made up of the collective consciousness, this sense of style. Maybe your preference in music. You think, oh, I have this individual, you know, taste in music. But actually, that individual taste is also made up of the collective taste in music. You're influenced by the collective, what's in the collective. For me, I'm always very interested in what is happening in the collective consciousness. That's probably why I looked up BTS, because I feel they're influencing masses and masses of young people. And it's quite fun to be able to identify exactly what's in the collective consciousness and how we can touch that and how that affects us. A very simple example is mm, ah, maybe I'll tell a story instead. I have a nephew. This story will probably help you to practice with this better than my other example. I have a nephew who came to visit me while I was in Deer Park, and he was only 6 years old at the time. So one day in Deer Park, we had a community work day. And during this, so once in a while, we would have what we call community work days. And the fourfold Sangha, which means the monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, would get together and try to realize some kind of project that is happening in the community. So that day, during community work day, everybody came out and was doing something. And my nephew, he was in charge of filling up the water bottles. And he's 6 years old. So he's sitting there next to the water spigot with a hose, just filling up these 5-gallon water bottles. And suddenly he said, why am I the only one working? Why is no one working? So, and I looked at him and I was like, it's community work day. Everybody is working. And yet he couldn't see it. He was just sitting there next to the spigot with the water hose, filling up the 5-gallon water bottles. And he said, why? Why am I the only one working? And then at that moment, at first I had this funny reaction. I couldn't believe he actually said that. And then right away I recognized, oh, that's actually my mother. So he spent a lot of time with grandmother, with grandma, because she babysat him. She's with him most of the day. And my mother has this habit. She would clean the house, do things around the house, and she's like, no one does anything around this house. you know, you know, why am I always doing things around this house? Nobody ever does anything around this house. I don't know if this sounds familiar in your household. If your partner ever says this, or your mother, your father. But at the moment, I looked at my nephew and I said, hello, Mom. Because that wasn't my nephew, you see. That kind of thinking came from my mother. And so when we practice, we also have to recognize the kind of thinkings, perceptions, mental formations we have. They're not exactly our own. We can learn how to identify where they come from. And when they come up, you can just say, hello, Mother. Hello, Father. I'm sure there's so many. Like when I drink a cup of tea, I say hello, Tai, because he's actually the one who taught me how to drink tea, like in stillness, without having to think anything, just enjoying the taste of tea, not even feeling pressured to have any conversation with Tai, because that's quite scary when you sit next to a Zen master. All kinds of things come in your head. And in the beginning, I'm like, what can I say? Like you're always trying to think of something smart to say. But then he's so quiet and he's just drinking his tea. So every single thought that comes up, every single idea that comes up just gets like edited out. And eventually I learned how to drink tea without having to say anything, without having to come up with a smart comment or proving myself, even while drinking tea. So when I drink of tea, I say, hello, Tai. Yeah. And that's a part of my collective consciousness, my individual consciousness being made of a collective consciousness. I'm not just made of me alone. I'm made of everything that's ever influenced me. And not only that, everything that has not influenced me. Let's say when you walk along the paths here in the upper hamlet, the brothers also had a community work day with the fourfold Sangha, I think, of the 3 hamlets. The sisters of New Hamlet and Lower Hamlet came to also help laying the bricks and the pavers that you see on the beautiful paths around Upper Hamlet. And so when you walk along those paths, the path is not just a materialistic path, it's also a manifestation of a collective consciousness. It's also a manifestation of consciousness. So when you do walking meditation along those paths, you can actually get in touch with the collective consciousness. There's a path in Lower Hamlet that cuts through the apple orchards, and our teacher, he didn't want us to walk that path. He always told us we had to walk around the orchard and then to the big meditation hall. And that's because we want to be able to enjoy our walking, right? But through the years, even while walking to the meditation hall, just for sitting meditation in the morning or in the evening, some people had the urge to be quick about it and cut through this apple orchard. So when you look into that shortcut through the apple orchard, you can also recognize collective consciousness, the energy of rushing, of wanting to arrive, of wanting to get there. So when we have this model, it really helps us to recognize when we have, let's say, a suffering, for instance, come up. We can recognize how it's been fed. None of these seeds can grow stronger or survive without food. Again, that goes back to use it or lose it. Right? And for our tradition, we have a very concrete practice to help you. So the basic principle is when something in our stored consciousness, there's all kinds of seeds. There's wholesome seeds and there are unwholesome seeds. And what our practice is to try to keep the wholesome seeds in our mind consciousness as long as possible. So when a wholesome seed manifests, we recognize it. Let's say a seed of happiness is touched off and it manifests in your mind consciousness and you can recognize it as happiness. You can invite another seed called mindfulness to come up and it will recognize and embrace this happiness and help you to keep it longer in your mind consciousness. So mindfulness can also do the same thing with anger. When anger comes up, you just invite mindfulness to come up and it can embrace your anger and help it to go down to sleep and help it to not become so stronger so it has a chance to sleep again in your stored consciousness. So the basic practice is when the wholesome seeds manifest, we want to keep it as long as possible in mind consciousness because we want to strengthen it at the base. And when a wholesome seed has not yet manifested, we want to invite it to come up in order to help it to strengthen. So sometimes in our community, when we do guided meditation, for instance, we're actually inviting the wholesome seeds to come up in order to help to strengthen them. Seeds of mindfulness, seeds of joy, seeds of happiness. And it's quite important to recognize when there is well-being in your mind and in your consciousness, in your body. The more we're able to recognize well-being, the easier it becomes to touch it, to generate more well-being. mm, we just had a summer retreat, and so I was working with the volunteers. We had 30, about 30 something volunteers in the lower hamlet, and being a volunteer and for our summer retreat could be quite intense because we have about 1,000 more than 1,000 people coming with us every single week, and so you can be quite exhausted. Uh, if you're going to do pot washing every single day, 3 times a day, could be quite tiresome leading a family. So you can get to a point where you're quite exhausted. Um, but I encouraged the staff in the last week to get in touch with their well-being. For instance, there are moments throughout the day where you don't feel exhausted. You don't feel tired because of the work. And you have to be able to recognize those moments. And also throughout the retreat, there are moments when you feel at peace. There are moments when you feel joy. There are moments when you feel at rest. And you have to be able to recognize them. Because as soon as a moment of tension comes up, it gets overpowering. And then you look at the retreat and you're like, oh, this retreat is so exhausting. And you forget all about the moments where you've had peace, well-being, or joy or happiness. And it's very natural for us it's our habit. We like to zone in on what's going wrong, on the things that are not going right, on the negative. And so a part of our training, rewiring, is also to uh, practice what we call appropriate attention and selective watering. So we pay attention to the things that are bringing us well-being. And the more we pay attention to things that bring us well-being, the stronger that awareness becomes. So we practice what we call selective watering. So when a negative mental formation or seed has not yet manifested, when it comes up here, we call it a mental formation. When it's here, we call it a seed. When a negative seed has not yet manifested, don't touch it. you know, you just let it sleep. So you don't go looking for things that like touch off your negative seeds, your fear, your violence, etc., your hatred, your anger. Um, so in terms of taking care of yourself, in terms of taking care of your mind consciousness and store consciousness, we really have to be selective of the kinds of food that we are offering ourselves. So in Buddhism, we speak of 4 kinds of nutriments. The first is edible foods. And yesterday, Brother Phap Lu spoke a little bit about eating meditation. Not just what we eat, but how we eat as well. And the way we eat can bring a lot of suffering to ourselves and others, or it could bring well-being to ourselves and others. Our teacher often speaks about the consumption of alcohol and meat, for instance, because of the volume of grains that are taken up, that are consumed in order to produce 1 pound of meat or 1 bottle of wine or alcohol. Meanwhile, there are so many people starving in the world. So the way you eat can be quite destructive to the environment as well as yourself, let alone many of the products now. There's so many different additives or the way food is produced. So really, how we consume food, it is an expression for love for ourselves as well as the earth. The second type of nutriment, I only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go through this really quick. The second type of nutriment is sensory impressions. So what you take in through your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, touch, can touch off seeds of craving, seeds of hatred, seeds of violence in you. When you read a book, when you watch a movie, when you listen to music, when you engage in conversation, it could touch off, it could contain a lot of toxins that touch off a lot of unwholesome seeds in you, like jealousy or craving or fear or violence. And we really have to be quite selective in what we allow into ourselves. Nowadays, I find when we don't have a kind of protection for our sensory input, because there's so much sensory input, especially when you go on the internet, for instance, you're just overloaded with sensory input. So we have to be quite selective in what we allow in, and also to preserve the integrity of our attention, also to preserve our peace and well-being. We know that there are so many young people nowadays with ADHD, for instance. That's because they have no protection for the sensory impressions that they allow in. It's overload, and everything is trying to catch your attention, and you don't know how to protect yourself in order to minimize the sensory inputs that you allow yourself to be exposed to. Also, many young, I heard this through my niece, and she's also a university student. So many people she knows at the university are taking drugs that are prescribed for ADHD patients in order to have better performance, in order to have better concentration, to have better performance. Because the young people, they're so pressured now. They have to learn so many subjects. They have to learn so many things. They have to compete to get into all these schools. And also they haven't been trained to concentrate the mind, to be mindful of what they're reading. For instance, when I walked into the library when I was at home, I saw how the young people study. They have their book in front of them, and they have their phone next to the book. So one line, phone, one line, phone, one line, phone. And it was very distracting, and there was no really concentration or mindfulness, mindful of what you are reading. So when you are able to train yourself and to strengthen the seeds of mindfulness in you, to train yourself to just focus on one thing at a time, and to be able to concentrate the mind, you wouldn't be so dependent on drugs to help you to perform better, to concentrate better. This is a training that is very possible. Before I came on my first retreat, when I went to classes, I used to take a lot of notes and pages and pages of notes. And then after my first retreat, I came home, and the strange thing was, when I came to class, I knew how to listen better to what the professor was saying. And I found my notes were just like a few words per page. But actually, all the information that I was receiving, I could retain better. And it's because of a different quality of attention that I was giving. And I learned how not to be so distracted by so many different things happening around. So sensory impressions is very important, to be selective in the kinds of sensory impressions and the amount of sensory impressions you expose yourself to. I'm sure my brothers and sisters will speak more about this. Brother Huang Han says it's okay, so I'll take up 5 more minutes. The next type of nutriment is volition. So it could be, volition is a desire. And it could be your deepest desire. So your deepest desire, or whatever desires you have, is kind of a food, food for your yourself, your consciousness. Let's say if you have a desire to make a lot of money, right? That's going to drive you, drive your thinking, drive your speaking, drive your way of doing things, just so you can have a lot of money. If your volition is to become famous, your thinking leads you in that direction. Your reasoning leads you in that direction. Everything you do leads you in that direction. And it may be good or not good for you. Depends on what you do with that fame. And let's say if your volition is to love, if you have a deep desire, like the leader of BTS, to love himself, if you have that one desire, in this lifetime, my goal is to love myself. That's also a very wonderful volition to have. And so in your daily life, you're going to seek out the things that can help you to love yourself better. Right? So volition is a kind of food, and it's a very important kind of food for each of us to have. I find that sometimes when we speak of volition, some people speak of purpose in life. It doesn't have to be that grand. Your volition may be the deep wish to be happy. That doesn't necessarily have to be a purpose in life, but every single day, every single moment, you're aware of that deep desire you have. So your conversations, your interactions, etc., you choose the kinds of conversations or interactions or the kinds of things that you're exposed to that can help you grow your happiness. The fourth type of nutriment food is consciousness. So consciousness can be a kind of food, like the examples I gave earlier. You're sitting in this room. The peace in this room is a kind of is from the collective consciousness, and that is a kind of food that you consume. Actually, when you are in an environment, let's say a neighborhood that contains a lot of violence, if you're in a relationship that contains a lot of violence, toxins, you consume that kind of consciousness. And speaking about purpose, for the young people now, in the collective consciousness, there's quite a lot of pressure for you to find, let's say, your purpose in life. So your desire to find that purpose in life is also the food from collective consciousness that you've received. You have that pressure. And I find purpose in life is good. But if you are feeling so pressured by it, then it's not so good. And you might see that the pressure you're feeling is because of the collective consciousness, the kind of food in the collective consciousness that you are consuming, for instance. So consciousness, individual and collective consciousness, it could be very positive or it could be very negative. I'll mention your sense of style again, for instance. Your sense of style, you consume also from the collective consciousness. And we should know that I think fashion now is like is it the second or third biggest polluters uh, kind of industry? Second biggest uh, industry polluting, uh, contributing to pollution in the world. And so this kind of collective consciousness that you are consuming is very negative and detrimental to Mother Earth. So when we look into ourselves, in our body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, we can also look in terms of how we can take care of our bodies, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness through the kinds of foods that we consume, through edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. And I hope that during this retreat, you'll have more time and opportunity to explore the kinds of foods that you're taking in, not just edible food, sense impressions, volition, consciousness. Um, and you'll learn much more about these types of consuming in the upcoming days, and a lot more about maybe feelings and perceptions, so that you can love yourself better. The respectable young monk who introduced me to the band called BTS is none other than our very own brother Phap who will be giving the talk on true love tomorrow. So I hope you enjoy that. Thank you very much for listening this morning and being here.